It's not 12 yet, so I'm gonna stop it until 12.
Bienvenidos a esta cuarta edición del Latino Film Market 2020. Desde la Gran Manzana, la capital del mundo, Nueva York. Vivian, ¿cómo estás?
Hi, Porfirio. I am so happy to be here with you today at this special event. And welcome to the 4th Annual Latino Film Market 2020. This year, everything is going to be virtual, from the capital of the world, New York City.
Como sabemos todos, Nueva York y el mundo entero ha sido afectado por la pandemia del coronavirus. Lamentablemente, esta pandemia ha afectado al mundo del entretenimiento alrededor del mundo. Por esa razón, hemos decidido llevar con este compromiso una plataforma a la comunidad latinoamericana. Pero antes de empezar, queremos dar nuestras oraciones a esas personas que han sido afectadas y a sus familiares de igual manera por esta pandemia. ¿Qué crees de eso, Vivi?
Unfortunately, Porfirio, this COVID-19 pandemic has affected the entertainment industry all around the world. But still, we stay strong and we move forward to commit to provide a platform for our Hispanic community in here in New York City, Latin America, and all around the world.
Pero ahora queremos que se relajen para que disfruten de las películas, el arte, la música, la danza de los diferentes países. Creo que va a ser algo excelente. ¿Qué tú crees?
That's right, Porfirio. You're going to enjoy films, art, music, dance, and educational panels. So relax, get comfortable, and thank you for supporting our Latinx filmmakers.
Saludos cordiales y bienvenido al Latino Film Market. Debido a lo que está ocurriendo a nivel mundial, hemos decidido hacer el evento de manera virtual. Ya saben por lo que está sucediendo el COVID-19. Pero desde aquí, desde la ciudad de Nueva York, les envío un fuerte abrazo a todos los latinos y a todas las nacionalidades que nos están apoyando. Los invito a ver cine latino, los invito a que disfruten del concierto cultural latino y también a que disfruten de nuestro hermoso arte. Además, no nos podemos olvidar de innovar. Así es que a través de nuestros talleres y a través de nuestros paneles van a poder innovar, aprender sobre presupuesto, aprender sobre subvenciones, aprender sobre las tendencias de los mercados. Así es que los invito a que echen un vistazo y puedan utilizar todas esas herramientas para avanzar. Greetings to all and welcome to the 4th Annual Latino Film Market. Because of what is happening right now in the world with the COVID-19, the pandemic, we have decided to do the event virtually. And from here, from New York City, I send you a big hug to all the Latinx communities and also to all the nationalities that are supporting us. Now, I would like to invite you to watch the Latinx cinema and also to enjoy our Latinx culture and our art. And you can be able to innovate through our workshops and panels about marketing, distribution, about music. So please take a look and enjoy everything at the Latino Film Market. Bye bye.
Hola, buenos días y bienvenidos a Latino Film Market 2020. Gracias a Arilyn Martínez Cora y a todos. Les traigo el saludo cordial del gobierno de la ciudad de Nueva York. Soy Angel Castillo, Commissioner of the Mayor's Office of Media and Entertainment. My agency oversees 4 primary divisions in service of New York City's creative sectors. Our Office of Film, Theater, and Broadcasting supports on-location filming throughout the 5 boroughs. We also run NYC Media, the nation's largest municipal-owned broadcast radio and television network. Our Office of Nightlife supports the sustainable development of New York City's nighttime industry. And our industry and workforce development programs support New York City's creative sectors of film, theater, television, music, advertising, publishing, digital content, and video games. Altogether, New York City's creative industries account for over $104 billion in economic activity and nearly 500,000 jobs for New Yorkers. Film and television production alone accounts for $60 billion in direct economic activity, $3 billion in tax revenue, and 100,000 jobs. Prior to COVID, film and television production was at an all-time high, with nearly 80 episodic series and 300 films filming right here in New York City. Among the primary reasons that New York City has established itself as a creative capital is the ingenuity and diversity of our city's workforce, which is why the work of Latino Film Market is so important. As many of you know, on Monday, New York City entered phase 4 of reopening, which means that filming can resume at indoor facilities at 50% occupancy limits, and exterior location filming can expand from 25 to 50 people throughout the summer, with a more robust rollout in the fall. This moment is a testament to New York City's resilience and commitment to ensuring a strong and safe recovery. We are starting up carefully and cautiously, and it will be so good to see New York City back on set. Thanks to you. Again, thank you for being here, and thank you to the Latino Film Market for putting together a wonderful slate of programming for this week. Stay strong, be safe, y cuídase bien.
Continuando con la transmisión del Latino Film Market 2020, edición digital. Qué bien se siente estar en nuestra ciudad. Este año estamos orgullosos de poder presentar 49 películas de América Latina y otras partes del mundo, incluyendo proyectos de Suiza y de Londres. Te invitamos a que navegues a través de nuestra página para que puedas tener la opción de seleccionar entre las diferentes películas que toquen temas de justicia social, las mujeres y la comunidad LGBTQ, entre otros. Así que relájate, busca un lugar cómodo y apoya a nuestros cineastas.
This year, We're proud to have more than 49 films from Latin America and all around the world. We also have projects from Switzerland and London. So please browse our page so that you can have the option to select films that focus on themes such as social justice, women's issues, and the LGBTQ community, among others. So again, relax, get comfortable, and thank you so much for supporting Latinx filmmakers.
I need a quick way to.
Okay, Tracy, now you can go on.
All right. Thank you, Erilyn. And thank you, everybody. I'm really glad to be joining you all today. My name is Tracy Kaufman. I am Programs Manager at Candid, which is the organization created out of Foundation Center and GuideStar, two data and research institutions that have been around for a long time. Foundation Center has historically been the #1 source of data and research about foundations and grants, whereas GuideStar has historically been the top source of data on the nonprofit sector. And I am going to be here today talking to you a little bit about how do you get foundation funding for your film? How do you write a grant proposal? How do you construct a grant budget? That's all going to happen throughout this afternoon. So we're going to start by talking about basic proposal writing, and then we'll take a break after that session, and then further into the afternoon, we're going to talk about budgets, and it's going to be terrific. Really happy to have you here, and if people have questions along the way, feel free to put your questions in the chat, and I hope this is helpful for you. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay. Okay. So I'm sharing my screen right now. I want to start by showing you a couple of different resources that my organization has that might be of use for you, and then we'll hop into a PowerPoint presentation. So what you should be seeing on your screen right now is a page that is created by Candid that provides information on how you find grants specifically for film or video makers. Some of you may have some experience in dealing with grants for film before, some may be pretty new to this. But if you're just looking for some basic information on how you find grants, this is based out of a site that Candid offers that is a free resource. It's called Candid Learning. It was formerly known as GrantSpace. Some of you maybe may have used GrantSpace for some resources before. And so this is part of our knowledge base that has informational articles on pretty much any question you could possibly think of here. And so this page here will give you some information. How do you find grants for film specifically? So we start with a little bit of advice. A filmmaker who has done some programming with us before on this subject starts by offering a few tips on grant writing success in the field of film. Some of these may seem obvious, and some things may just help kind of get you organized on how this process is going to work. Just make sure that you understand how competitive this process can be. Be sure to apply early and often for grants, and let the deadlines help you create some structure. And kind of when you're writing grant proposals, it's easy to think of it as a very dull, tedious process, and it can be. But to try to think about what brought you to this field to begin with, and what gave you the motivation to create this film to begin with, and let that kind of motivation and excitement become part of the filmmaking process as you're writing this grant. You're conveying and communicating your creative vision to a funder and trying to get them as excited about your creative vision as you are. So make that part of the filmmaking process. There's also the research piece that's mentioned here. And pretty soon I might show you a little bit more about how the research process can work in all of this. But research is going to be key, making sure that you're approaching only the people who are going to be most interested in supporting the specific type of film that you are planning to do. One other resource I have here, actually, I'm going to see if I can copy the link for this into the chat here so that you'll have access to this information. Also, for those of you who may be affected by COVID in a financial way, we also have a lot of resources on how do you find financial help due to COVID-19 hardships. And we have this kind of assistance available for a lot of different fields, but there's a lot of grants for artists that have been initiated as a result of COVID, because artists in particular have been having a lot of financial difficulty as a result of COVID in not being able to share and perform art in the way that they normally need to. So there are some resources that have been put together for this from groups like Americans for the Arts, Creative Capital, New York Foundation for the Arts has an emergency grant program. There's a lot of really good stuff out there. I'm gonna paste this into the chat as well. So that's just a little something to get us started. And at this point, I hope you can all see my PowerPoint on your screen. Let's just talk a little bit about what does an effective grant proposal look like. So this is just a little bit about my organization here. So again, I'm with Candid, formerly known as Foundation Center and formerly known as GuideStar. I have been with the Foundation Center half of Candid for 13 years now. I come from the world of book publishing and libraries originally, and I started at Foundation Center 13 years ago as a librarian, helping people in our physical library do their research and find grant opportunities. And now I primarily teach classes for Candid on how do you write grant proposals, how do you develop relationships with funders, how does corporate giving work, all kinds of things like that. If you want to learn more about what we do as an organization, just check out our website or our social media. Anyway, an introduction to proposal writing. Here's what we're going to cover here today. So we're going to go over what the basic elements of a grant proposal are going to be. Funders are all over the map in terms of what their requirements are and what they may ask for from you, but they're all going to have the same basic elements in place of the same things that they're going to want to hear from you. We're going to talk about what makes a standard project proposal be as effective as it can be, and talk about how do you submit a grant proposal and how do you follow up with funders after you submit. So it's important to see how all of this fits in with the process of getting grants. The writing is just one piece. It's important, but it's only one piece. So the fuller ecosystem of all of these steps of proposal writing, it starts with planning. So you have planning, which follows into research, then finally writing your grant proposal, and then whether you get the grant or do not get the grant, there will be follow-up, and the follow-up is incredibly important, and you don't want to forget it. There's also a piece that's not mentioned on this screen here, but is also important, which is building relationships. I think as part of the Latino film market, there's a bit of networking built into this this program this week, and so it's going to be really helpful if you haven't already been doing a lot of networking related to your filmmaking. It will be really, really crucial as part of your success in making films to be able to network and cultivate relationships. When it comes to getting grants, you could follow all of these steps that we're covering today, and you could write the most perfect grant proposal, and you could make the most perfect film. But you might still be at a disadvantage in the grant seeking process if you can't establish that relationship with funders. So figuring out how to get a relationship going with a foundation is going to be key. Figure out, how do you meet these people? How do you get introduced by people to a funder that you're interested in? And how do you kind of cultivate and build and steward those relationships over time? It's going to be a big piece. So anyway, the process of proposal writing begins with planning. And so planning is going to mean two different things. It's going to be partly, what exactly are you going to need the funding for? Figuring out, if you're, for instance, working on multiple projects at once, which project of yours takes priority right now? What do you think is going to be the most appealing to funders at this moment, and why? And how much funding do you really need? Because of this, a lot of people actually start with their budget before they write the narrative portion of their grant proposal, because writing the budget first can kind of help you get really organized in terms of what are the things that you need in place, how much does it all cost, and how much money are you planning to ask for? Grant seeking is very, very competitive. So you want to make sure that you're well organized in what specifically you're asking for. You never want to be vague when you're approaching funders. You want to have a very clear ask in mind for them. And also planning is about giving yourself enough time. So we're mainly talking about grants from foundations today. And foundations are a very slow form of getting money. If you need money quickly, that's what individual donors are for. You want to talk to people in your network if you need money more quickly, or think about crowdfunding campaigns if you need money more quickly. But getting a grant from a foundation is less about, here's the money that we need a few months from now, and it's going to be more about, here's the money that we're going to need this time next year. So this is because after you submit a grant application, it can often be as long as 6 to 9 months after you've submitted the grant application before you actually have the money in your hands. So planning is all about time, both time in terms of how many grant applications can you realistically manage at once. Do you want to do one at a time? Do you want to do several? Do you want to do many at a time? And do you have the bandwidth to handle that? And figuring out how long it's going to take before that money might come in. And the next piece that's going to be very important will be research. Research is all about figuring out who you are going to approach. So this basically means making sure you're identifying which funders are interested in your type of project. Even if your film is amazing, that doesn't mean it's going to be for every funder. Foundations always are very particular about what they do and do not fund. So you want to do all of your due diligence to figure out who out there is funding the types of subjects that you are dealing with. Let's say you are doing a film that has a social justice focus in the Bronx, for instance. You would want to do some research to figure out which funders are interested in funding stories about social justice in the Bronx, or at least in New York, things like that. Because even if what you're doing is really special and really valuable, you don't want to send your proposal to a funder that just doesn't normally fund that type of work. So this is about as good a moment as any to show you how you might do this research. I'm gonna minimize my PowerPoint for a second. And I'm gonna go back to the web. And I'm gonna show you very quickly Candid's research database, the Foundation Directory Online. So this is an online database that has over 165,000 different funders. And so you can use this to research who is funding what types of things. So for instance, the type of search that we just did here, that I was just using as a hypothetical example. Let's say we wanted to fund a social justice documentary film in the Bronx. You can just type in natural human language into this search field, and the database will figure this out for you. Hit search. Up here on the top, you're going to see whatever you typed in, this is what the database did with it. They searched and they saw the word film, and so they're doing searches to see who funds film and video, who funds media justice, anti-discrimination, public affairs, etc. And if you at any point see something that you think, oh, maybe this is not what I want to have in my search, you could click the little X and take that out of your search. So for this example of a search here, you're going to see a list of funders who match what you just put into your search, and you'll be able to see where they are, which is not always the same thing as where they fund, how much money they have, how much money they give, how much money they have given out in the subject area that you put into your search, and how many different grants they gave in your subject area. You can look and see who has received grants along these lines, what year they got the grant, how much it was for, and frequently, if you click on the dollar amount, you'll be able to get a short description of what this funding was for exactly. So being able to see past grants that already took place, this is helpful for a couple of reasons. This is partly so that you can see in real life who is funding what projects. What does the landscape of film funding look like in the fields that you're working in? Who's been giving grants? Who's been getting grants? What are the typical dollar amounts that are going out? It kind of gives you an idea of who to approach and how much to ask for, and what types of projects have been doing well. Also, you're going to be able to see who's been receiving grant funding, and if you see anyone here that you know or that you could get to know, maybe someone that you've collaborated with before, this could be helpful if you need an introduction to a foundation. It's going to be easier to get a grant if someone at a foundation has had a conversation with you before, even if it's just a phone conversation. So let's say you have friends involved with the Bronx Documentary Center. It might be worth, in that case, contacting them and first of all, seeing if they would be willing to put in a good word for you, make an introduction for you, or if there would be a way to partner with them, to collaborate with them on a grant funding opportunity. And that might give you better success at getting grants. You'll be able to get an idea here of who are some organizations that have been really successful in receiving grants here. And this just gives you a good idea of the landscape. So it's important to know, I don't think I mentioned yet, that part of being eligible for most grant funding from foundations involves having access to 501c3 status, like the nonprofit status that any nonprofit organization has. And I know this is sometimes a point of confusion for artists who consider themselves just an individual, not an organization necessarily. So if you're relatively new to this at all, It's worth knowing that you may have better luck if you're affiliated with an organization. Like some of these organizations that you'll see listed here may have individual artists under their umbrella, and it may be worth considering getting a fiscal sponsor. Fiscal sponsorship is a really great resource for artists who want to be eligible for more foundation grants. So for anyone who doesn't know about fiscal sponsorship, because I know every day I meet people who don't know about it but should know about it. So fiscal sponsorship is when you enter into an agreement with an existing 501c3 nonprofit organization where you sort of operate under their umbrella. They don't control your project in any way. You do your work in the same way that you would otherwise. But the one difference is that it means when you want to apply for a grant, you have access to that organization's 501c3 tax-exempt nonprofit status. So what that will do for you is that is going to make you eligible so that you will be able to receive a grant. So foundations are very heavily regulated by the IRS. This is probably a good moment to go right back into these slides here and just tell you a little bit about how foundations work. So foundations are under a lot of regulation by the IRS. And so one of the major rules that any foundation has to follow, otherwise they will be shut down. They are required to give to charitable organizations for charitable purposes. And the way that they're able to prove that they have given to a charitable organization for a charitable purpose is by only giving to 501c3 nonprofits. So if an organization has a nonprofit status, then they're allowed to receive grant funding. And so all of that works out easily for any nonprofit, but that's just where things get more complicated if you are an artist rather than an entire organization. So that in order to get grants, you just need to affiliate yourself with a foundation. And then at that point, you will have a lot more grant opportunities than you otherwise would. It's a really, really helpful resource, and tons of organizations offer fiscal sponsorship. There's a good website out there. It's called the Fiscal Sponsor Directory, and they provide listings of all kinds of organizations that offer fiscal sponsorship. There are tons of them, and they're most common of all for artists. So it's going to be a very normal thing for any artist, any filmmaker to approach a fiscal sponsor about having one of these types of arrangements. And so what you're seeing here is a little information about what are foundations. So first, you're seeing examples of a few different types of foundations. So what it means to be a private foundation just means that either a very wealthy individual or a very wealthy family or a very wealthy company, they decide that they're going to make their philanthropy official. So they take a large amount of money and they use it to establish a grant-making foundation. So a private foundation is it's a foundation giving out grants that gets all of its money from one single source. So this means they generally never run out of money. These are a lot of the foundations that most people have heard of before. For instance, the Ford Foundation, private foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Knight Foundation, or the Kellogg Foundation. Those are all examples of private foundations. It's by far the most common type that you will find. But there are differences in different types of private foundations. Because these can include the really, really large foundations like the Ford Foundation. And they do give a fair amount of funding to film, by the way. But it also includes very, very small family foundations that are exactly what they sound like. They're just run by families. I sometimes like to compare these small family foundations to the Wizard of Oz, because Behind the curtain of money and the legal structure of foundations and all of that, in many cases, there's just a person. A lot of these small foundations don't have any staff whatsoever. So it's important to know the difference between something like the Ford Foundation that has a lot of staff. They have program officers and assistants and everything. And some of these small foundations that are just run by a person or run by a family. And some of those small foundations, they have a lot of money to give and they're required to give out that money. But some of these small foundations, they don't take unsolicited applications always. And the reason for that is not because they don't want to give out that money to people. It's usually because they don't have the capacity to take applications from the public. A large funder that has staff, they can solicit applications from the general public. They can take thousands of grant proposals every year because they have enough people to read them. But a foundation that doesn't have any staff, they don't have enough people to handle that kind of flow of applications. So what they want to do is do their own research and figure out who they're going to invite to submit a proposal. So it's helpful to know this, just so that you know when you find maybe a small family foundation that says that they're well aligned with what you do, but that they don't take unsolicited applications, you don't have to just give up there. It's just about making sure that you can introduce yourself to them. You might be able to find a connection who can introduce you, or sometimes you can just call them on the phone. If you're going to call them on the phone, just be careful, use your time wisely. Just make sure the phone call is short, concise, to the point. You might need to write down a couple of key questions that you want to ask them, and just make it a really natural human conversation, just a getting to know you kind of call. And what that's going to do is put you on their radar so that they know a little bit more about you, and you can cultivate that relationship, just like you would develop a relationship with any person and network with a person. You can network with foundations in that same way. Let me actually pop out of here one more time to bring you back to the database there and show you how do you figure out, for instance, that a funder is going to be well aligned with what you do, and figure out how to contact them. So this is the foundation directory online again. We were searching for grants. So let's actually look at the Ford Foundation, since we were just talking about them. When we click on a foundation, we will get a profile. If a foundation has a website, we'll include that right at the very top. Keep in mind, over 90% of funders do not have websites at all. A lot of this is because of those small family foundations. So a lot of them don't really have a web presence, but they will be included in this database here. So you'll be able to look through with any foundation and figure out, okay, what do they fund? They give you a breakdown between the different subject areas that they're funding here. What do they fund a lot? What do they fund a little? And keep in mind, so you're making films. Technically, that's arts and culture, but also think about, what are you making films about? So even if someone is not normally known as an arts funder, if you consider the content of your film and think about why that might be interesting to a funder. For example, you see human rights is up here at the top of the Ford Foundation's priorities. If your film, for instance, deals heavily with an issue related to human rights, it might still be a fit with their funding priorities, and that might be a good match for them. So you can still consider it. Also, think about where the funding is going. You'll be able to look at a map and see where grants are going a lot, where they're not going as much. If you're doing work outside of the United States, you can also click this larger button underneath and switch this to a world map and see who's funding overseas. Also, take a look at the typical grant sizes. This will be helpful for you. Think about how much money do you need and how much money are you aiming to ask for. There's a big difference between needing $5,000, $50,000, $500,000, and making sure that whatever amount you're looking to ask for, that this funder provides grants in that size, that you're not asking for something that's either way too big or way too small for them. This is part of finding the fit and part of doing your research. You'll be able to see listings of grants that this funder gave out in the exact subject area that you put into your search. Keep in mind, you can adjust your search all the time, add things, take things out, and your results are going to change constantly. You can look at a full listing of all the different subjects that they give towards. Population groups. Do they have a focus on certain population groups that they like to support? Like, for instance, if you see this area here, people of Latin American descent, that's the way our database will phrase that anytime you're searching for, okay, who is specifically going to be interested in Latino film projects or any type of initiative that affects people of Latin American descent. You can read more about the foundation's kind of mission statement, basically. This is the funder talking about what they care about. The Ford Foundation, for example, they several years ago shifted their focus entirely towards addressing inequality. And they break that down into more detail so you can take a look and say, okay, the work that we're doing, does it have to do with any of these issues that they talk about here? Does it have to do with gender, ethnic, and racial justice? Does it have to do with equitable development, inclusive economies, etc.? You can take a look at what is involved in an application. So this is where they'll give you directions on, okay, is there a deadline or do they take applications all the time? That's going to vary a lot depending on the funder. Is there a place you can go to download an application for them? Or do they just want you to send what they call a letter of inquiry, the one-page thing that you send before they invite you to send a full proposal? And if they don't take unsolicited applications, this is where they're going to tell you that. So all that means is you have to network your way in if that's the case. You can take a look at the foundation's tax forms if you want to. Like, I wouldn't recommend it if you don't have to, but you could. Who's who? This will tell you who is involved with that foundation so that, first of all, you might know who to try to talk to and send an application to. Or if you see these LinkedIn areas here, you can often click into that and find out if you have a connection, if you know someone who knows someone at that foundation. Very helpful for your networking. Eventually, at the bottom, you'll have their contact information. So if you just want to call someone there or you want to email someone there, you will always have that ability. Before I forget, the way that you might access this, this database here to do this kind of research. So normally this would be a subscription database. However, we have partner libraries where you can access this for free. And granted, many, if not most libraries, their locations are shut down because of COVID right now. But a lot of our partner libraries who normally provide free access to the foundation directory, they're providing free remote access right now. So what you can do is you can go to this website here that was formerly called GrantSpace and is now known as Candid Learning. And you can go to the area that says Ask Us. Ask Us connects you to our online librarians. Our online librarians are real librarians, staff members who work for us. And you can either live chat with a librarian, or if it's not normal business hours, you can send an email and you can ask where the nearest location is, where you can get access to the foundation directory online. and they'll be able to look up and see if your nearest library is offering free access right now. Like for instance, I'm talking to you from Brooklyn right now. Brooklyn Public Library is currently providing free remote access to the Foundation directory online. But wherever you are, they'll just ask for your location, they'll find your nearest library, and they'll figure out how can you get access to do the funding research that you need to do. So I think that's the extent of the web resources I'm gonna show you. Let's get back into this PowerPoint here. So we're talking about foundations. Like I just said, the most typical type of foundation is gonna be an independent foundation, also known as a family foundation. There are also company-sponsored foundations, corporate foundations. So those are obviously foundations that are set up by a company. So if there is a very successful corporation that decides that they want to give out grants through a foundation, they will establish a private foundation, which has ties to the company, but legally it's its own independent structure. A corporate foundation, it has its own money, it has its own board of directors, and it's subject to all the same rules and regulations as any foundation, of which there are many. So like one of the things is all of their tax information has to be public knowledge. So you can look at a corporate foundation's tax returns for free any day of the week because it's required to be public information. Also, all foundations, like you may see on your screen here, are required by law to give away at least 5% of their assets every year. So that's how much they're giving out in grants. Every foundation currently gives out at least 5% of their assets in grants every year. There are some foundations that are giving out more right now due to the COVID pandemic. There are certain foundations that have decided that they are going to double it, that they're going to give away 10% of their assets for maybe the next 2 years. So some of the biggest foundations have agreed to do that. I know Ford Foundation is one of them. The Doris Duke Charitable Foundation is another one. The Andrew Mellon Foundation, which is a major arts funder, they're also giving away 10% of their assets for the next couple of years. But the important thing to know about this is that this is what makes foundations a really good source of support. Because if you're approaching individual people for funding, any of us as a person, we have a choice. We can give money or we can not give money. It's up to us. But foundations don't get to make that choice. Foundations have to give away a certain amount of money every single year. It's just a question of, are they giving it to you or are they giving it to someone else? And that is something that can give you a little bit of comfort. Operating foundations, you'll see there, are not usually going to be one of your top choices, just because operating foundations, they're not a very common type of foundation, but they mostly fund their own internal programs, like research institutions. They commonly are operating foundations where they give grants to their own research programs. So I wouldn't worry about them too much. Other types of funders you might find, corporate giving programs, that's different from a corporate foundation. So keep in mind, companies give a lot to the arts. They really do. And it's because companies give for reasons of visibility. If they think you are doing something that's getting an audience, like if you are making a film and a lot of people are going to see it, that would be an incentive for a company to want to give you money because this is a form of advertising for them. But a corporate foundation is still a foundation. A corporate giving program is part of the company itself. So this means a corporate giving program, they give away money. They give away a lot of money, but they're not subject to any of those rules that a foundation would be. They don't have to give away a certain amount of their money every single year, and they don't have to share information publicly about what they're doing with their money. So because of this, it's a little bit harder to research a corporate giving program. You're not going to find as much information, but don't be scared off by the lack of information, especially because companies give a lot to the arts. You still want to consider them. Just be careful about making sure that there's a strong match values-wise between the company you choose to work with and the work that you're trying to do. Grant-making public charities, those are sometimes going to be a common funder for film projects or any artistic work. A grant-making public charity, they give away grants, but the difference is they're not a private foundation, they're a public foundation, which means their money doesn't come from just one place. They fundraise in order to have funding to give away. And you'll find a lot of the common funders for the arts showing up in the grant-making public charity category. Things like your local arts councils. Arts councils are kind of like a grant-making public charity. So they get money from elsewhere, and then they kind of re-grant a lot of it to creative projects like the ones that you're doing. Also, things like community foundations. Any region is going to have its own community foundation usually, and they give away a lot of really, really wonderful grants that are kind of locally based, but they have to fundraise in order to have that kind of money to give away. So it's just helpful to know the difference between the kinds of funders you may be looking at here. Okay, before we look at the different structures of a grant proposal, let's talk a little bit about formatting. If we were doing this class maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, we'd assume that you're talking about a paper grant proposal where you just write a long, pretty narrative, 10 pages long maybe. But nowadays things are different because most funders are moving towards online applications. And this is going to make your life a little different. Grant makers, foundations, they love online applications because it makes their lives easier. They can enforce deadlines more easily. They can impose word limits and character counts so that applications don't get too long. It's really great for the funder's side, but it can be complicated for the grant applicant. So if you're doing an online application, sometimes it might still be a free-flowing narrative, but you'll just have to send it electronically to the funder. They'll say, oh, send us a 5-page narrative as a PDF, something like that. Or it may be an online web portal. And that's really the trickier part that some funders are doing. They'll send you to a website where they're going to ask you a series of questions. They're going to have some text boxes. And so if you had a very pretty proposal that flowed like a story, it's going to get all broken up into these chunks. So it's harder to tell your story that way. And in these web portals, they will often have very strict word counts. They'll ask you a question, and then they might say a limit of 200 words in your answer. And so if your answer required 300 words, that means you have to trim it down ruthlessly. And it's going to be hard. It's hard for everybody, but it's just an important thing to know. What is going to help you a lot when it comes to online applications, especially those web portals, make sure that your proposal is written out in advance elsewhere. Like write everything out first somewhere. Sometimes people say do it in a Word document. I would actually suggest using a Google Doc because a Google Doc will save as you go along, so you don't have to worry about accidentally losing all of your work. And you'll be able to copy and paste into the web portal and just trim things down and shorten them as you need to, but it'll save you time and you won't run as much of a risk of the server crashing and you lose the entire application. It's the kind of thing that happens to people all the time. So just protect yourself from some of the more obvious risks that you're going to run into. So that's formatting. But pretty much all proposals to foundations are going to include most of what you're going to see on your screen here. In particular, what you see under the narrative. Foundations are going to ask you for a statement of need, also known as a needs statement. They're going to want a project description. If you're working through an organization or a fiscal sponsor or something like that, They'll want some overall organizational background information. Those are a lot of the basic things they're going to ask for. And then they'll provide like a list of here's all the other things they want from you, including the budget. Later today, we're going to do a separate session just about how you write a budget if you've never done that before. I know people get scared of the budget, but a lot of funders look at the budget first before they read anything else. And so because of that, it's important to not neglect the budget and make sure that it makes sense, it's clear and complete. And the budget is not as hard as it sounds like it's going to be. It sounds intimidating, but it's really not as bad as it sounds. But here, we're just going to talk a little bit about what the narrative is going to look like. So what do funders really want to know about you? So funders want to know a variety of things. Really, funders want to see you make a compelling case for support. This needs to be a persuasive piece of writing. A common mistake that people sometimes make is that they think that a grant from a foundation is a donation. Don't ever think of it as a donation, because a donation is a donation. A grant is like an investment. So you need to treat it as an investment and treat your proposal to the foundation more like a business proposition. A grant is an investment in your project. It's an investment in the community that you're discussing in your film. It's an investment in your issue area. And like any investment, a funder is going to want to see a high return and a low risk. So what do we mean by high return, low risk? If we were starting a business, having a high return on investment is going to mean a financial return on investment. The funder wants to make their money back and then some. In a grant from a foundation doesn't want to make their money back. They're not supposed to make their money back. But what they want to see as a return on investment is that you're going to do something great with their money. You're going to do exactly what you said you were going to do with their money, and there's going to be results. People are going to see this film and they're going to be affected by it. It's going to have far-reaching impact. That's really what they want. And a low risk just means there's a low risk that things could go terribly wrong along the way. So you really want to prove to them, can you carry out this project in the most effective and efficient way? So overall, what they want to know is, like, they want to see you make a win-win proposition, that them funding you is going to be beneficial for both of you. It'll benefit you, obviously, because you would get the funding and you'd be able to make the film, but you also need to make the case for why this investment is a good idea for this foundation. It's going to be worth it for them. So what's the win-win proposition? What's in it for the funder? How does this film focus on the funder's interests in addition to your own interest? So talk about, like, when you do your research, you'll know what this funder really is interested in. What's the kind of social change that excites them? And what does that have to do with the film you're making? What's the connection there? The why is as important as the who. Why should this funder care about this project? And how does this film project help advance the funder's goals as well as your own, if that makes sense? So the questions that a funder wants answered in your proposal, they want to know, what specific need are you addressing? What are you trying to achieve here? What is your strategy for making this happen? How will you know if you're successful? Why are you the best person to do this work? And how is this project going to sustain itself overall? So let's talk about these questions one by one a little bit. So the first thing that comes up is, what specific need are you addressing? So this is the need statement piece of the proposal. Every foundation asks for a need statement. I like to, again, make the business analogy and think about the fact that no business starts itself without first identifying a hole in the marketplace. Why does the world need this film that you are creating? Who are you making this film for? What are you making this film about? What is the purpose for it? Think about it in terms of if the lack of this film existing is a problem. Like our film is about such and such, and people not hearing about such and such is a problem. Therefore, there is a need for this film to be made. So when funders say needs statement, they don't mean how much do you need this money? Because obviously you need the money. We all need money. This is about why does the world need this project to happen? It's about what's the problem that needs to be solved. Or I also like to think of the needs statement as the beginning of a trailer for a blockbuster movie, which I guess is an appropriate analogy given that we're talking about film here today. So if you think about a blockbuster movie and the trailer for that film, how do they all start? They always start with, in a world where there's no justice. Stop right there. That is the need statement. The whole rest of what you were going to say in that film trailer is the rest of your proposal narrative, talking about, I don't know, the superhero who's going to swoop in and bring justice or whatever it is. That's the rest of your proposal. The need statement just says, in a world where there is no justice. It doesn't present the solution to the problem yet. It just states, here's the time, the place, the people, and the challenges that they face. So the need statement frequently comes first. And so if you do it right, it sets you up beautifully for the rest of the proposal. They often in the need statement will ask about the population served. So whatever community you are trying to reflect specifically here, talk about them. Talk about who they are, the problems they face, and you have to be able to back up your claims when you're talking about the problems that your community faces. You have to provide relevant facts and statistics. Sometimes you can borrow things from census information or local, like city data, things like that, to talk about the communities that you're dealing with. Maybe talk about like what is the average income level of people that you're going to be discussing or serving through your film work, whatever it is. What does schooling look like for this community? Are there food deserts? Whatever it is, and can you prove it? Whatever is relevant to the subject that you are going to be talking about in your film. Just make sure that it's relevant, that it fits, as it says here, the size and scale of the solution that you're going to provide. So whatever you're going to say in the needs statement to talk about what the issue is, back it up. But also, if you're talking about a major problem that exists out there, just make sure that you don't paint such a grim picture that the situation seems hopeless. You have to make the film that you're going to make look like part of the solution. It brings knowledge, it brings awareness, and it therefore brings hope so that the funder understands that their funding will make a difference towards bringing this knowledge and bringing this visibility to the issue. So that's the need statement. So that talks about the problem. Now we're going to start talking about the solution. So now we're going to talk more about the specifics of your film work. What are you trying to achieve? How do you plan to solve the issue you brought up in the need statement with measurable outcomes? What are measurable outcomes? Well, we start here by talking about what are your project's goals and objectives. Goals and objectives, they sound similar, and they are, but they're a little different. Your goals are going to be broad and general about what you want to accomplish. Objectives are going to flow from those goals, and those objectives are going to be more specific and they're going to be measurable. There's an acronym that people often use when they're trying to create their objectives, and the acronym is SMART. You want to figure out the results that you want your film to accomplish. You want to figure out intended results that are specific, measurable, achievable, and realistic, and take place in a defined time frame. Like you could say, we want awareness of our issue that we're discussing in the film to be increased by, I don't know, by 40% over the next 2 years as more people view this film. We want this film to be shown in schools as part of education about a specific issue so that the younger generation becomes more knowledgeable about this issue our community faces. That's just an example of how you might do it. It's all about figuring out a plan for what does success look like to you. And once you've identified what your goals and your objectives are, now what are your strategies for making them a reality? By what methods are you going to accomplish these goals? And this comes down to a specific plan of action. So how are you going to make this film? How is your plan going to be implemented? Who is going to be working on the film? What exactly is going to happen? Where are you filming it? When are you starting and how long is it going to take? This is like outlining a timetable with a step-by-step plan of how you're going to accomplish this. And if you have any collaborations or partnerships as part of this, you're going to want to emphasize those too. It partly helps give you a little extra credibility if you're working with other people, and it makes it look like you've got a greater chance at success if you have some teamwork going with other people to help out with things. And funders really like to see people working together for greater impact rather than just duplicating each other's efforts in different places. And after you have outlined your plan, now how do you know if you're going to be successful? So all of those objectives and goals that you outlined beforehand, now you want to put those into measurable terms. Here's how many people we want to see our film. Here are all of the places we want it shown. We want it to appear in various film festivals, or we want it to be seen in schools or what have you. How big is the audience? Who is the audience, the intended audience? And from there, you're going to identify what we call key performance indicators, KPIs. These are just, it's a messy term, but it just refers to what are the things that when they happen, you know that you're on the right track and you know that you're succeeding. If your film is chosen to be shown in a specific film festival, does that mean that you're on the right track to succeeding? When 500 people have viewed your film, is that like a step on the way to achieving your goals or something? Or whatever that number may be. Is it 1,000 people? Is it 10,000 people that are viewing this? But just being clear on what are your goals and how do you know that you are achieving them? How are you going to collect the information to see if you're achieving your goals? Let's say you have a trailer up for your film, it's visible on YouTube, and you're checking how many views you have on that trailer. And every so often, you're going to check and see, okay, here's how many people have viewed the trailer. Here's how many people have clicked through to our website to find out more. And just develop a timeline to monitor the success over time. Really, there's both quantitative and qualitative measures to show that a project is successful. Quantitative means you can measure the success of your film project in numbers, and qualitative means anything that's not numbers. So like quantitative measures of success could be something as simple as how many people saw your film. And qualitative can be like, do you have proof that they liked it or that it affected them in some way? This can be things like quotes and testimonials from people. If someone was really, really moved and affected by your movie and they provide a quote, or you got reviewed in a newspaper or a magazine or something, and you got a really great review, that could be a qualitative measure of success, things like that. And just keeping track of both of those as proof of your success. Why are you, like it says here, why are you the best organization to do this work? If you are part of a larger organization making a film, then yes. If you're just a person or you're a team of people, why are you the best team of people to do this work? This is the section where you're establishing your credibility. If there are two things every foundation wants to feel from your proposal, it's credibility and impact. Those two things. If you can showcase your credibility and your impact, then you are in a great position. So giving some overall background information about yourself and the rest of your team, that is going to feed into your credibility. Why should you be trusted to receive funding to do this film project? So you're going to talk about what got you involved in this work to begin with, and what other work have you done? And the rest of your team, what other work have they done? You want to show like examples of other films you've done, other types of accomplishments you've had, your reputation, your visibility in the field, what makes you trustworthy and credible. And so if you're brand new to this type of work, just make sure that you are partnering with other people who do have a little more experience, so that even if funders don't know that they can trust you yet, they will be able to trust some of the people that you're working with, and that will make them a little more at ease. The thing to know about foundations is that they're very, very risk averse. Funders are very risk averse. They like to say that they value innovation, and maybe some of them do in some ways, but really what a foundation wants is a sure bet, a sure thing. They want to know if they give you this money, nothing bad is going to happen. So your job is to put them at ease. So this is your organizational background information. And then how is the project going to sustain itself? This is the financial sustainability section, and every funder asks about it. They just want to know, what's your business plan exactly? And they want to make sure that they're not going to be your only funder. Where else are you going to get money from? And if they are unable to give you a grant, because they might give you a grant, they might not be able to, how are you going to financially support the film if this grant doesn't go through? So talk about, have you received any other grants? Or are you approaching any other funders about grants? Because it's good to have multiple funders if you can. Do you have any individual donors or investors who have put money towards this project? Have you run a crowdfunding campaign? Do you have an earned income stream, like revenue generating activities? Have you sold like some kind of, I don't know, t-shirts or some kind of interesting swag related to this film project that helps kind of get a little bit of money in? Whatever your plan is that's helping to sustain you financially, it doesn't have to be perfect. They just want to know that you've at least been thinking about it. What are your business plans and how do you plan to sustain this to the end? Because even if a funder can give you a grant once, it also doesn't mean that they can fund you forever. So are you going to be okay with or without their funding? That's what they want to know. Even if you often feel like you might not be okay without their funding, you need to make them feel like you have that confidence, even if you don't fully have that confidence yourself. Really diverse funding streams are the key. Try as hard as you can to make sure you have money coming from as many different types of places as possible, so that if money runs out in one funding stream, there are other funding streams that can make up for it, giving yourself a sense of security that way. A conclusion. So a lot of these proposals, after you've explained all of that information, now you just have to tie it up in a neat little bow. So the conclusion can seem a little hard to write after you've already said everything, but this is what we call the so what question in the conclusion. If this grant happens, how will life be better? For whom will it be better? And why should this funder care? Why should this specific funder fund this specific project? Why will this be a mutually beneficial thing? This is what we call walking the funder to the fit. So this way, they've seen, oh, you're putting together a really interesting film and you've done your research and it looks like everything is good. And then this is why funding this makes sense for this supporter. Because this is really a partnership. If they give you a grant, you're a partner of this foundation. And why do they want to have their name attached to this film? How does it look like something that they can be proud to be involved in? That's what should come across in your conclusion. If they ask you for an executive summary, this will be similar to if they ask you for a letter of inquiry. It'll be a lot like that, in that it's your whole proposal basically just distilled down to one little page, just shrunken down to a one-page summary. And anyone who doesn't read the budget first is likely to read the executive summary first. So it's another part where you want to put your best foot forward. Make sure it sounds good. So make it attention grabbing. Think of it as hitting all the key points of a newspaper article, the who, what, when, where, how, and why. And it's going to contain a lot of the same elements as your proposal, only smaller. It'll have small versions of your needs statement, your project description, your background information, how much money you're asking for. That'll be important. What helps for writing this, even though it's shorter, it's sometimes harder to write the one-page summary. So usually we'll often advise, write the entire long proposal first and then write the executive summary. Same goes for a letter of inquiry. Write your full proposal and then write a letter of inquiry. Because at that point, you've written all the difficult, complicated stuff, and you can look back on your longer proposal and you can pick out the highlights. What are the things you want to make sure a funder doesn't forget, that they absolutely will know no matter what? And pick out all of the best parts and put that into the executive summary. And then supporting materials. Some of this may be very unique for film. They might want samples of your work. They might want pieces of scenes that you've shot just to see, like, is your work good or not? But really, they're going to tell you exactly what they need from you, and make sure that you send everything that they ask for and nothing that they don't ask for. In the arts in particular, I think people get really tempted to just send everything they can possibly think of to stand out from the crowd, but you might run the risk of sending too much. And at that point, you're just making a lot of extra work for the funder and extra clutter, and it might not actually help you. But oftentimes, like, there will be a budget involved. If you're working through a fiscal sponsor, they're going to want, like, your fiscal sponsor's IRS determination letter and their tax statements and things like that. But they'll tell you exactly what they want. If they ever ask for something that you do not have, don't just leave it out. Use it as a relationship building opportunity and call the funder and say, oh, I don't have this one thing you asked for. Is there something I could send in its place? And on the one hand, you will have your question answered that way. And on the other hand, you will have had an opportunity to have a conversation with someone at the foundation. Every time you can have a conversation with someone, it helps build that relationship, and that helps build your case. You'll notice the bottom here, it says for online applications, you can sometimes add links. So if you want to add a whole bunch of extra stuff, links to other films and things that you've worked on, and you didn't have a chance to like send them DVDs or anything like that, you can add links when possible. Because the thing with a link is a funder gets to make the choice to click on it or not click on it. Just make sure that your application can stand alone even if they don't click on the link. But it's helpful that, like, if they really love what they're seeing, they at least would have the option to learn more by adding a link. But make sure everything is legible, everything's easy to read, no typos, no fancy fonts or binders or things like that. Some of this may sound obvious, but you'd be surprised. Sometimes people think, oh, why would I need advice about typos? And then someone will submit a proposal that has a couple of typos, and that's the thing that makes them look less professional to the funder, and that costs them the grant. It can be very tiny little things. So just make sure that you have this thing proofread nicely and you're really confident and comfortable with what you're going to be turning in. A little bit about how you follow up with funders. And then afterwards, if anyone has questions, I'll take questions, and then we'll be able to take a break before we do a session on budgets. So following up. The interesting thing is that whether you do or don't get the grant, there is still often follow-up. So let's say you got the grant. They said, yes, we like it. We're going to give you the grant. All the basic things that you're going to do are keep the funder informed, first of all. Frequently, funders are going to have grant reports that they're going to require from you. There may be like a mid-year report halfway through where you give them information. Here's where we are so far, how much we've done, how much money we've spent. Here's whether we're on track to get this thing finished in time. And they'll usually have an end of year report as well. So just send your required reports on time. Be responsive whenever they contact you and have questions. Do what you said you were going to do with the money, things like that. And when you get a grant, oftentimes you'll get a letter back from the funder before you actually receive the money. So that grant letter, you sign off on it, you send it back to the foundation, and that's a really good chance to include a thank you letter, and that kind of builds the stewardship process. This is not the end of the journey when you get a grant. It's the beginning of a partnership. So treat your funders like people, because they are people. Make sure that you keep in touch with them. It's a relationship that you want to keep going. Like if you have a regular program officer, keep in touch with them now and again, and make sure that you're talking to them even when you're not asking them for money. This is like one of the key things that bothers program officers at foundations, is like when the only time they hear from their grantees is when the grantee is asking for money. But like check in once in a while. Let them know if you hit a major milestone, you had a major accomplishment with your project, let them know about it. If you're having an event or something like that, you can invite the funder. They might not always be able to come because they tend to be busy, but they'll remember that you asked and they'll appreciate that you asked as well. So all of this is really good for relationship building and also paving the way for a renewal request if you need to ask them for a grant this time next year. Now, let's say you did not get the grant. So, fun fact, even if you did everything right, even if you wrote a perfect proposal and you've got a fantastic film that you're making and you did your research and you sent this to the perfect funder, there is about a 1 out of 3 chance that you will get the grant, which means even if you did everything right, there's a 2 out of 3 chance that you will not get the grant. So because of this, it helps to submit more than one grant application if you can. Like, put out more applications than you need money. Like, if you want to get 1 grant, apply to 3 different funders. If you want to get 2 grants, apply to 6 different funders, etc. So hedge your bets. So keep in mind, if they didn't give you the grant, there's a pretty good chance that it's not personal. Funders get a really competitive field of grant applications towards them. And so a lot of times, if you ask for feedback, and you can and should ask for feedback, they will often tell you there just wasn't enough money to go around this year. And it's often true. If they got a lot of strong applicants and they only had so many that they could take, even if they really like you, maybe this year was not the year. But it's worth contacting them and asking for that feedback so that you know whether or not it's worth applying again the next time around. And if they tell you, yes, we think you should apply again, that's really encouraging. And you might have a better chance of getting that funding this time next year, because at that point, you'll have more of a relationship with them. And oftentimes, if they give you a no, that like if you ask them for feedback and they say, we really don't think this is a good fit with what we do, at least you know that information and you know not to bother with that funder again. Figure out when to move on and seek other prospects. If they just say, this is not a fit for us, apply somewhere else. You can put your energies elsewhere. Or also, if you've applied to the same funder like 5 years in a row and you still haven't gotten the grant, figure when it's time to cut your losses eventually. But otherwise, if they give you an encouraging answer and they say, try again next year, we like you, you can still keep up the relationship over time. You can keep them informed about your work and your progress, but just keep it strategic. Don't put them on your mailing list. But again, like if you have a major accomplishment, you can write to them and let them know, guess what? We were accepted into this film festival, something like that. So that way, like you have that relationship that's still going. All right. As we're winding down with all of this, some key takeaways here. Start with an outline. That's basically just write a generic draft proposal before you actually start submitting something places. It's that kind of boilerplate generic language will help save you time later. Some things you can copy and paste and use for different funders. Other things you'll have to adapt and tailor for certain funders' requirements. Keep the language clear and concise. This is important. Don't use any jargon. Like, don't write in a dry academic style. Aim for something that's just clear, direct, and straightforward. The best advice I have heard on the type of language to aim for is write as though you are writing for a highly intelligent high school senior. So like you're writing for an intelligent audience that can figure things out, they can connect the dots, but don't assume that they are an expert in your subject area. They might be or they might not be. And more than one person is likely to read your proposal. So make sure that you can write for multiple audiences, whether someone is a big expert in what you're talking about or someone is not at all an expert in what you're talking about, that they can still understand what you're trying to convey. So because of this, it sometimes helps to give your proposal to someone else to read, especially to someone else who doesn't work in your field. Like give your proposal, for instance, to someone who's completely outside of the film world. Have them read it. If it makes sense to them, you might be on the right track. Focus on the funder's interests in addition to your own. Talk about why this makes sense for this funder. Why does this fit for them? And if you do your research, you'll know what will fit for them. Make use of that database, the Foundation Directory. You can access it for free through many, many local libraries. Follow directions. Again, that sounds obvious, but yes, follow your directions. And revise and edit as you need to before submitting. Just give it to other people to read, etc. For other types of learning, Introduction to Project Budgets is going to be the next session that I'll be doing for you today. So we're going to take a little bit of a break and then we'll talk about budgets. And if you really want to dive deep into how to write a grant proposal, we have an online self-paced course, the online proposal writing course. It takes like a couple of weeks to go through. It has like 15 different lessons and it'll go very, very deep into every piece of a grant proposal. So that might be helpful for you as well. Thank you very much. If you have questions, I'm happy to take a few minutes to answer them. And otherwise, afterwards, we'll take a break. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for now. Okay, I see some questions here. To show that my project has other funders, do you suggest I submit many RFPs to several foundations simultaneously? The answer is yes. So usually you want to apply to as many foundations as you realistically can. Like, you don't want to completely overdo it. You're not going to find like 20 funders to apply to simultaneously. Like, a large nonprofit organization might be able to find 20 different organizations to apply to. But usually figure out how many you have time to apply for versus how much money you need. But if you can find, say, 5 different opportunities, then yes, apply to 5 different opportunities with the understanding that maybe only a couple of those will work out. And think about, how much does your project cost? Do you need, say, $50,000? How many funders might you need to apply to get to that $50,000? Maybe apply for 10,000 here, 10,000 there, and see how many you can add up to. Okay, and the question about a mission statement, that foundations frequently ask for mission statements, and what are the elements of those? So when foundations ask about mission statements, they are usually, they have nonprofit organizations in mind. So every nonprofit organization is required to set up a mission statement to say, this is why we exist. This is the social change that we aim to make in the world. Things are going to be a little bit different if you're a filmmaker. If you're a filmmaker, there's first of all going to be the question of, are you working through a fiscal sponsor or not? Because if you are, that fiscal sponsor is a nonprofit organization, and they will have a mission statement. So frequently you might include their mission statement, but also talk a little bit about kind of the inspiration behind your film work. Why do you do the work that you do? What would you consider your personal mission? But this is why it is often really good to work through a fiscal sponsor, because you can talk to them also and get a little bit of insight from them on what you might need to include as part of your mission. The question of, must we set up a website? You don't have to, but it certainly helps a lot. Just having a web presence is going to be handy. Even if you don't set up an official website, maybe you have a social media channel that's very active. For some people, this is going to vary. Depends where your primary audience tends to live online. Does it make sense to set up an entire website? It is good, because funders, they're going to want to vet you in some ways and make sure that whatever you're doing looks legitimate and credible, things like that. So having a lot of information on a website is good. But if you don't have the bandwidth to do that, you could do something similar that's easier. You could set up a blog, that's easy. Or maybe you have a really active Instagram page where you put constant updates. I guess the youngsters lately are using TikTok. That, I guess, makes a lot of sense for film because it does video, things like that. Or at least like have a trailer up on YouTube, things like that. Just make sure that you have an existence online in some way. It helps, first of all, gain you an audience, and it helps the funder research you. Just like how you have to research funders, funders do the same thing to you. They will research you and make sure that they like what they see when they do research you. So you don't have to do anything too glossy or fancy necessarily. Just make sure they can find the basic information that you'll need. Okay, I see another another question about, how do you meet funders? This is what everybody wants to know. How do you meet funders? It is, in some ways, it's a little trickier in a pandemic, in that in the old days when we were not in a pandemic, I would often advise people, get on the mailing list of your favorite foundations. And whenever they say that they're going to be speaking at an event somewhere, show up at that event and introduce yourself. And I guess that still stands, but there aren't going to be as many in-person events nowadays. But if you see funders that are going to be speaking in some kind of online event somewhere, they do a lot of online panels. And so if you can be there, you can learn about them, ask questions that way. LinkedIn is pretty useful. Foundations are usually present on LinkedIn, particularly the ones that have staff. So you'll be able to connect with people there and see if you have connections in common. A lot comes down to networking and figuring out who you know in common with people. So if you have friends in this industry who have gotten grants, who have they gotten grants from? And can you have a conversation with them? Can you either work together on a grant proposal, or can you get them to put in a good word for you? Or do you already have a funder or two? If you already work with a current funder, your current funders are probably the #1 best source of a referral to new funders. Foundations, funders, they talk to each other. It's a very small world in grant making. So if you already work with someone who knows you and likes you and gives you money, that will be your absolute best referral. Or if you have like a big donor, a big investor, someone who's any person who's already put money towards your project, figure out who did they know? Who can they put you in touch with? Those are probably some of the very best ways that you can do this. But don't be afraid to do a little LinkedIn stalking, because a lot of funders are active there. Also, if you do any work through like your local arts councils, like I don't know if we're mostly New York area people or if this is a much broader audience than that, but like I know the New York audience most of all, but probably other cities will have their equivalents of this, your different like local arts groups, like New York Foundation for the Arts, for instance. They are a funder themselves, but they're very accessible. And they will often provide a lot of capacity building training for people. They'll do workshops and things. And so if you get to know them and get referrals from them to other funders they know, or the arts councils, different regions have different arts councils. Again, I know New York in particular. We have like the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, Brooklyn Arts Council, Bronx Council on the Arts, places like that. They, first of all, they provide funding, but they also can help you network. They can help connect you to other people. So have a lot of conversations with a lot of people and see where it takes you. If you're in other geographic areas, you have your own versions of these arts councils and of these foundations. Some of these places are less intimidating, like these small local arts councils and arts funders. They generally will have a small staff and be reasonably easy to connect with and talk to. So talk to them, because they're going to be easier to talk to than like a huge private foundation. But if you want to talk to a bigger foundation, you can call them on the phone. Like make sure that they don't say on their website, no phone calls ever, ever, ever. But otherwise, like a lot of these places that don't take unsolicited grant applications, they'll take phone calls. Just make sure you know who you're talking to and why you're talking to them. You might not talk to a program officer right away. You might be talking to a receptionist, an assistant, and that's okay too, because those are the gatekeepers. And so if you're nice to your gatekeepers, if you're nice to assistants and receptionists and you're respectful, they can potentially open doors for you. Just try to script yourself. Maybe write down a question or two that you want to make sure to ask so that you don't get kind of caught off guard and start rambling, telling your life story. You definitely want to be respectful of their time. Don't go on forever telling your life story. Just try to keep it concise, to the point, ask an intelligent question or two, and listen as well as talk. So make it a real human conversation, and that's going to be really effective for relationship building. So networking is going to be so important, and not everything is going to work. And some of these relationships can be slow to build, but do what you can. Also, I just saw a question about how to do the online proposal writing course. I am gonna try to put a link in here. that's going to show how you do this. Let's see. I'm looking for the link for that specific class. Otherwise, let's see here. Proposal budgets, online proposal writing course. We have a lot of different courses here that you can do self-paced. So I'm going to put a link into the chat here. I'm not sure if these links I'm putting in are private or going public, but I'm hoping either Catalina or Erilyn can copy them into the chat if mine don't come through publicly. Great. So there's a link to the online proposal writing course, and we have a lot of other self-paced courses as well. I can share that link too, because we have them on a variety of different topics. Whether it's proposal writing, budgeting, we have one on how to build relationships with funders. So I hope that might be useful as well. Let's see. Do we have any other questions before we take a break here? Otherwise, at 2 o'clock, we'll be able to meet back and we'll talk a little bit more about budgets in particular, which sounds scary, but it'll be fine. You're going to ace the budget. Okay, so I think that should be good for now. If you come up with other questions during the break, just feel free to bring those back at 2 o'clock Eastern, about 20 minutes from now, and we'll talk about them while we talk about budgets. But I hope this was at least a little bit helpful for you, and I'll look forward to talking to you guys again in about 20 minutes from now. Thanks, and hope to see many of you then.
We will see you here. Thank you. We're going to see you here again at 2 through the same link, okay? Thank you. Everybody love it.
Great. Glad to hear it.
games. Altogether, New York City's creative industries account for over $104 billion in economic activity and nearly 500,000 jobs for New Yorkers. Film and television production alone accounts for $60 billion in direct economic activity, $3 billion in tax revenue, and 100,000 jobs. Prior to COVID, film and television production was at an all-time high, with nearly 80 episodic series and 300 films filming right here in New York City. Altogether, New York City's among the primary reasons that New York City has established itself as a creative capital is the ingenuity and diversity of our city's workforce, which is why the work of Latino Film Market is so important. As many of you know, on Monday, New York City entered phase 4 of reopening, which means that filming can resume at indoor facilities at 50% occupancy limits, and exterior location filming can expand from 25 to 50 people throughout the summer, with a more robust rollout in the fall. This moment is a testament to New York City's resilience and commitment to ensuring a strong and safe recovery. We are starting up carefully and cautiously, and it will be so good to see New York City back on set, thanks to you. Again, thank you for being here, and thank you to the Latino Film Market for putting together a wonderful slate of programming for this week. Stay strong, be safe, y cuídase bien.
Continuando con la transmisión del Latino Film Market 2020, edición digital. Qué bien se siente estar en nuestra ciudad. Este año estamos orgullosos de poder presentar 49 películas de América Latina y otras partes del mundo, incluyendo proyectos de Suiza, de Londres. Te invitamos a que navegues a través de nuestra página para que puedas tener la opción de seleccionar entre las diferentes películas que tocan temas de justicia social, las mujeres y la comunidad LGBTQ, entre otros. Así que relájate, busca un lugar cómodo y apoya a nuestros cineastas.
This year, we're proud to have more than 49 films from Latin America and all around the world. We also have projects from Switzerland and London. So please browse our page so that you can have the option to select films that focus on themes such as social justice, women's issues, and the LGBTQ community, among others. So again, relax, get comfortable, and thank you so much for supporting Latinx filmmakers.
Hi, Tracy. Please feel free to jump in again, okay?
Okay, sure.
Thank you so much. How was the break?
It was good, mostly just checking in on my son. I told him I'm going to be talking at the computer all afternoon, so he gets me for 20 minutes in between.
Thank you. Okay. I'm going to remove myself, all right?
All right, great. Okay, welcome back, everybody. I hope everyone had a good, quick rest in between sessions. I don't know if everyone has decided to stay on to learn about budgets, and maybe if some have not. In my experience from teaching these subjects for a long time, I find that teaching about how to write a grant proposal, like the narrative part of the grant proposal, we always have a full room for writing the narrative piece of the grant proposal. Lots and lots of people. And then when it comes time to talk about the proposal's budget, there are tumbleweeds blowing through the room. We consistently get very, very small numbers of people wanting to hear about the budget. And the reason for that is that the budget intimidates people. Like, people get less frightened of the idea of writing about the work that they're doing, but people get very scared when it comes to talking about the numbers associated with the work that they're doing. They get really scared of the idea of budgets and spreadsheets and that there's going to be math involved, and like, people want to be in denial of the fact that they have to ultimately do the budget. The thing about the budget, though, is it's so much easier than it sounds like. It's so much less frightening than it sounds like. So mostly this session is about demystifying the idea of the budget. You have to do the budget. It's incredibly important to have a good budget, but it's much less frightening than you think it's going to be. It is numbers, but it's numbers that ultimately you should know. The only way you can do your project effectively is if you know what the numbers are that are involved. There's a little bit of math, but it's easy math. It's math that most of us learned in elementary school. It's not calculus or anything like that. It's simple addition, subtraction, things like that. So why is the budget so important? For those of you who watched the first session of earlier today, I mentioned that a lot of funders will look at the budget first before they read any of the pretty words that you wrote about your film. They will immediately skip past all of the beautiful words that you wrote, and they will go straight to the numbers, straight to the budget. Some of this is, think about who is going to be reading this grant proposal. If you're talking about a private foundation, for instance, sometimes you might be going after grants like through your local arts council and things like that, and you might have a slightly different experience in that setting. But if you're talking about grants coming from a private foundation, sometimes people mistakenly think that the program officer is the person who decides whether or not they get the grant, and that is not the case. At best, the program officer at a foundation is your advocate for getting a grant. The program officer takes the first pass at the proposals. They will read them and decide what looks good, what looks less good, and they take the good ones and they bring them ultimately to the board of directors. One thing that you might notice when it comes to deadlines for foundations is some of these funders, they'll have maybe 3 deadlines in a year. They'll say, oh, proposals are due in May, July, and November. If they say that, there's often a good chance that that's because the foundation has its board meetings in May, July, and November. So it's the foundation's board of directors. They are the biggest decision makers. So it's not just a program officer who's reading your proposal. It's going to be oftentimes board members. Think about who sits on the board of a big foundation. It's like big corporate types. It's like, imagine a hard-boiled CFO type, a chief financial officer at some corporation, sitting on the board of a foundation, and it comes time to look at proposals. Does that financial officer on a foundation's board care as much about the beautiful words that you wrote about this project you're working on? Maybe, but in many cases, they're going to skip past all of it and go straight to the budget. They say, show me the money. And that's because with the money, everything becomes clear. They can see exactly where every dollar is going. They can learn everything they really need to know, or at least that they think they need to know about this project just by looking at the budget. So all of this is to say that the budget tells a story as much as the proposal's narrative tells a story. And the 2 stories need to match. Everything that is in the written narrative of the proposal should be in the budget. Everything that's in the budget should be in the written narrative of the proposal. The 2 should match. Sometimes we'll say that the budget is a mirror reflection of your grant proposal. You should be able to hold the two things up next to each other and have someone look at them and be able to tell that they belong to the same project. So a budget doesn't need to be messy or complicated. It just should be clear, and it should tell a story in numbers. The way that your narrative tells the story of your film in words, the budget tells that same story translated into the language of numbers. I hope that starts to make it sound a little bit less daunting, but it's something to start with. All right, I'm going to share my screen again, and we'll do a little PowerPoint time. Okay. Here we go. Okay, so you should see my screen now, and it should say Introduction to Project Budgets. So after we finish this session here, which I think is a simpler session than the narrative piece, this usually doesn't go on quite as long as the other one, you'll be able to have a better handle on the basic elements of a project budget. You should be able to estimate your film project's expenses and its projected income, and figure out how to follow up after you get the grant. We're going to be optimistic here and say that you're getting the grant and tell you how to follow up once that happens. Okay, so what do funders want to see in a budget? They don't want to see any type of miraculous thing here. What they really want to see is just your estimate of the true cost of the project. Questions that I often get on the subject of budgets are really often people thinking that there's one magic number that a funder is looking for. How much should I put down for this expense or that expense? Only you can know that. It costs what it costs. You want to show a pure honesty in your budget and not try to guess what you think the funder wants to see. If a piece of equipment costs a certain amount, then by God, that is the cost and that's what you put down. Frequently, people try to either undersell themselves or oversell themselves in budget, trying to kind of play games with the funder. You don't want to play games with the funder. Just make sure everything is on the level. Even if a number seems strange or surprising, as long as that is the honest number, it's fine. A funder might come back to you and ask questions and ask, why does this cost this amount? And that's fine. It means they're interested, at least. The point is that if a funder comes back to you with questions, you should just be able to answer their questions without breaking out into a cold sweat. That's the important thing. Make sure you're never putting yourself in a position where you're pulling one over on a funder. You're always giving a true answer. So sometimes people think that they need to ask for much, much less money than they need so that a funder will like them. And that's not true. Like, if you ask for less than you need, then you're going to get less than you need, and then you won't be able to do the work. Or sometimes people try the opposite approach and they ask for much more than they need and they inflate numbers, but that's going to cause you problems too. And at some point, the truth is going to come out that that's not really the true cost of things, and you're not going to have as much grant success. So really just put down, how much do things cost and how much income do you anticipate you're going to receive to meet those costs? So it's really, you have expenses, you have income. Like, if you get scared about planning budgets, think of it as though you're throwing a party. You're throwing a house party and you put down a list of all the things you need. We need food, we need refreshments. What kinds of food, how much is it going to cost? We need drinks, we need ice, we need plastic cups or something. We need music, we need decorations. And if it's a very elaborate party and you need to hire people to help with portions of the party. Maybe you need to hire a band or something. How much does that cost? So that goes into the fact that consider people as part of your budget as well, because people's work has value and people's time has value. So like think of it as that way, as though you're planning a party, and think of all the things you would need. Think of your film, your project, your work that you're doing, all of the things that you need. What do you already have? What do you still need to get? How much does it cost? And consider your people. Your budget can be a really good advocacy tool. You can advocate through your budget for what you really need and what things really cost. And that includes if you need to pay people a salary, that you should be able to pay people for their time and for their labor. So don't pretend like the people who are working on your project, that they don't have a dollar value to the work that they're doing. They do, and you want to reflect that in your budget. Because if you don't ask for what that labor costs, then you don't get that money. You get exactly what you ask for. So anyway, off my soapbox for that, and let's talk about what are the components you'll find in a project budget. You have your income. Here's how much money either you have or you're planning to get. Some of this will be projected income. Some of this will be money that you already obtained. And then you have your expenses, which include both direct costs and indirect costs. Direct costs consist of personnel and non-personnel. And then we'll talk a little bit about indirect costs, because that's the one part that gets a little messy. So let's talk about expenses first. Expenses are a little trickier than income, so we'll just get that out of the way first. And at the end, I'll have some time for questions if you have questions. So here's what I said earlier, and here it is reflected right back at us on the screen. Your budget should be a mirror reflection of your proposal. There's nothing fancy here. It's just everything you talk about as part of your project. It has a cost attached, whatever it is, and make sure your budget reflects that completely. People often ask, who is the best person to create the budget for a project? And the answer is really whoever knows the project best. Like if you're in charge of the film, you are probably the person who knows the project best, and so you're the best person to do the budget. I know when we talk about things in the context of an organization, people sometimes ask, oh, should I just have finance people make the budget? If I've got like an accountant, should they make the budget? Not really. Often if you have a financial or accounting person as part of your work, you might get their input on very specific things in the budget, but they would not be the primary person to create the budget because they don't know the project as well as you know the project. So what they're able to do won't be as complete as what you are able to do. So your budget should reflect your proposal completely. Everything that is in your proposal should be represented in your budget. There should be nothing vague, nothing incomplete. All right, how will I know how much my project costs? If this is something pre-existing that you've more or less done before, then you would already know how much it costs. But if this is something new, you're starting from scratch, what you're going to do is for every thing that is part of your project, every expense that you're going to have, what you're going to do is research 3 estimates. Like, let's say as part of your project, there's going to be travel involved and you have to get a plane ticket to somewhere. You just get an idea of, through a few different types of flights or airlines, 3 estimates of what that might cost. Collect and document each quote. And then from those 3 estimates, choose the estimate that's most reasonable and appropriate for your project. That's all it is. Or like you have to buy a piece of equipment, research 3 estimates for that piece of equipment, document each quote, and then choose the one that seems most reasonable for your project. Again, this is an area where there is no magic number. You don't have to pick the cheapest one just because you think that's what funders will like, if the cheapest one is not going to be necessary for what you need to do. Or you don't need to pick the most expensive one just because you think that means you'll get more funding. Nor do you necessarily have to pick the in-between one. Just think about your project and what you are really gonna need for that, and just pick what works for you. Just don't think so much about what you think funders are gonna want, and think about what you want. So do that for every single line item in your budget. And now let's look at the budget. We're gonna start by looking at personnel. For a lot of people's work, personnel can frequently be the most expensive piece. This frequently will take up the bulk of a budget. Like, I know in nonprofit organizations, that's definitely the case. For a film, I guess your mileage is going to vary depending on how many people you have involved and what kind of equipment or other costs you're going to have. But if you find that paying people is taking up a lot of space in your budget, that's completely normal. Because if you don't pay people, they tend to stop showing up. So pay people. It's helpful. So here we're looking at personnel. So this just means any staff that you may or may not have on a project. Depending on your structure, maybe you have full staff you're working with. Maybe you just have a couple of freelancers that you have involved. It's all going to depend on your personal situation. But like for this hypothetical project we're looking at here, you want to list all of the people that are involved in a project. Think about how much each person earns as part of a salary. So personnel just means who's getting a real actual salary here. If you're just paying freelancers and there's just like either a flat fee or an hourly rate, don't worry about them under personnel. That's going to be different. But if you have actual staff that receive benefits, health insurance, things like that, that's personnel. So let's say, like we have here, you have a few different people who work on your project. That executive director at the top, at most organizations, an executive director, they are running the place, and they're not necessarily spending all their time working on specific projects. They're doing a lot of management, administration, but maybe they spend some time with a project. Let's say the executive director has a salary of $60,000 per year, but they only spend about 10% of their time working on this project that we're fundraising for. So if they make $60,000 a year, but they only spend 10% of their time on this project, we don't put their entire $60,000 salary into the budget here. Instead, we take 10% of their salary because they're only spending 10% of their time on this project. So 10% of $60,000, that's $6,000. That's what would make it into the budget. Meanwhile, let's say you have a program director. They make, let's say, $40,000 a year, since they can't make more than the executive director, I guess. So the program director will say they make $40,000 a year, but they spend 100% of their time on this project, all of their time. That means, yes, we can put the entire $40,000 into the budget here because all their time is spent on the project. The program assistant. Let's say we have a program assistant who divides their time in between two projects equally. And the program assistant, let's say they're pulling in $20,000 a year, but they only spend half of their time on this project. So if they spend half their time on this project and their salary is $20,000 a year, which is not very much, but you know, nonprofit and creative jobs are what they are. So half of their salary would be $10,000. That would be in the budget. Make sense so far? Any staff that you have, whatever percentage of their time is spent on this project, that percentage of their time is put into the budget for this project. So their salary, How much time will they dedicate? Just do the math on that. Pretty simple math here. And put that down. And then if these are actual full-time staff, like they get benefits, they get health insurance, things like that. If that's the case, you add that into your budget as well. So this may apply to some of you and it may not apply to others of you. Like if you're just dealing with freelancers, then you might not have to worry about this. But if you have staff that receive benefits, then yes, that goes in. And there's a pretty simple calculation to figure out how much you put into the budget for benefits. To figure that out, first of all, if you are in an organization that has finance people, then all you would have to do is ask your finance people. Ask, what's our fringe benefit rate? And they might tell you 20% or 25% or something like that. Otherwise, what you're going to do is look at your entire institution that you have, if you have one, add up the entire cost of how much is paid out to everyone on staff for benefits. Like how much do you pay out for health insurance? How much do you pay out for life insurance, etc.? And so the entire massive total of however much gets paid out to everybody for benefits, that's one number you need. And then add up how much everyone earns in salaries, not just for this project, but just for everything you might do at an organization, your entire staff, their entire salaries. So what's your total amount of wages that you pay out for an entire staff versus what's the total amount that you pay out for benefits for an entire staff? So you divide your benefits into your total wages, and that's going to give you a percentage of what's the rate that you pay out from the total of salaries for a fringe benefit rate. So that's just division there. So it might be 20, 25, 30%. Let's say it's 20%. We would get that subtotal that we figured out earlier. We paid like $6,000 for the executive director, $40,000 for the program director, $10,000 for the program assistant. That gives us the subtotal. Take, let's say, 20% of that subtotal and add it to the subtotal. Like I think our subtotal was like $56,000. Figure out what's 20% of $56,000. It's like a little over 10,000. Add that to $56,000, and that gives you your personnel total here. So really, mostly we're doing addition, a little bit of like division and addition here, and that is most of the math that we do here. And that gives you what you would pay your staff. Now, let's look at non-personnel. So if you're just a person, you don't have an organization or anything like that, you're just a person, a filmmaker, hiring some people freelance style. You didn't need to worry about the personnel if that's the case. Those people are non-personnel, along with all the other stuff that costs money as part of your project. So let's say you are hiring, let's say, some freelance actors, freelance cinematographer, freelance art director, etc. And let's say these people are charging an hourly rate or flat fees or whatever the circumstance may be. You just put that down simply of however much you need to pay those people as a regular cost. So they don't count as personnel just because they don't receive like regular benefits. They're not getting health insurance from you. Other than that, it's just a question of thinking, what are the other things that you do that cost money, and just laying it out in a little spreadsheet the way you see it right here. The easiest thing is just to forget something that's important. So just try not to forget. A lot of times people find it easier to create their budget first before they write a narrative for a proposal, that it kind of helps you get your thoughts organized. But think about all the different things that are involved, all the people that are involved, all of the pieces of equipment that are involved, any travel that's involved. Do you have to feed people when you're on set? If so, include food. Do you need to rent a space or pay for a space or get permits to shoot on location somewhere? Things like that. What are all the different things that you might need? Do you need to print like promotional materials or anything like that? Are you creating a website where you have to pay like a web host or something, or you have to pay a web designer to create things? Every single detail you can possibly think that's going to cost you, just write it all down. We're not worrying about where we're getting the money from yet. We're just thinking about how much money we have to spend on this thing in reality. Supplies, equipment, food, travel. Another thing, are you getting any volunteer help for this? Or is anyone donating equipment to you? That is going to be an important thing to think about here. So if you have volunteers helping you, or you have people donating supplies or donating equipment to you, then hold that thought, because we're going to talk about that soon. Otherwise, all of your different things that you need in order to make this project happen, add it all up, and you have your direct costs. So you're almost there. So that almost takes care of our expenses. But there's one other thing, and that's indirect costs. So this is something that is the bane of the existence of most nonprofit organizations, I know. And you probably have versions of these in the work that you do as well. So what are your indirect costs? So these are also known as administrative costs, overhead costs, supportive services, operating costs, things like that. But they're also known as the cost of doing business. They are costs that are not directly attributable to this film project, but they're necessary to make it happen. They're also known as hidden costs. So why do we call them hidden costs? Here's an illustration to show your direct costs, which is everything that we just talked about, versus your indirect costs, your hidden costs. So why do we call indirect costs hidden? It's because all of the things that we just showed, things that involve the people, like your actors, for instance, or your camera crew, things like that, or all of the supplies, the sets that you might need. Anyone, including funders, they can see and visualize your project and its impact and the beauty of the film. Like, they can see this film as you're writing about it. They can visualize your actors. They can visualize your sets. Those are all your direct costs that they're able to visualize. But they often can't visualize as easily these things. The rent that you pay. Like, are you planning this film out of an office, or are you doing this out of a home office? What's your phone bill look like? You're making work calls probably. You're probably doing lots of Zoom meetings with your people that you work with, and Zoom Pro costs money. What are your office supplies that you're using? Do you have like a computer that you use for this and a million other projects at the same time? What are your utility bills? Your electricity? Like, you can't consider having electricity to be part of your film project directly, but if you flip the light switch and nothing happens, you can't make your film. So this is why we call it the cost of doing business. These are things that we can't say are completely just part of the film, but we need them in order for the film to happen. If you don't have a phone, you can't really make your film happen. If you don't have electricity, you can't make a film happen. If you don't have like a place in which to operate that you pay rent on, it's going to be really hard to make this film happen. If you employ any marketing people to get the word out, it's hard to argue that as being part of your direct costs, but you need this in order for your project to succeed. The paper that you take notes on when you're like storyboarding something, you need all of that stuff funded. But these all count as direct costs. These all keep the project running. So keep in mind, some funders out there will not fund indirect costs at all. And some will only fund a percentage of it. And some will fund a lot of it. Really, it's just about following the funder's guidelines here. And I know in the nonprofit world, this is a very loaded subject, the subject of overhead costs and funders, whether they will finance it or not. In the old days, foundations really did not provide much of anything to fund people's overhead. And as a result, a lot of organizations collapsed because they could only get funding for the immediate direct programs that they were doing, but they couldn't pay their rent. They couldn't pay their electric bills. And it became a huge problem and places couldn't survive. Like, we would never ask that of for-profit companies to just pay their rent through magic. But we ask it of things that are being made for a greater good kind of purpose, which would include both nonprofit organizations and creative work. That historically funders would ask the moon and the stars of people to try to pay their rent through magic. But indirect costs keep things running, and so it's really important. Funders are starting to evolve on the issue. Increasingly, foundations are starting to provide more and more overhead support for people's projects, but it's important to keep an eye on what funders say that they will provide. Some funders say we will provide up to 10% in overhead costs. So let's talk about how you figure out what is your percentage of overhead for your project. We're looking at an example here of a hypothetical organization that runs two different projects. This hypothetical organization, first we're seeing what are their direct costs for their project, like the program staff or the equipment that's involved in running that program or project. So this hypothetical program, they have a youth leadership program where their direct costs are about $200,000. And they have another separate program under the same organization, college prep program. That program, its direct costs are $300,000. So this means for that entire organization, direct costs are $500,000. So we know that. We know what the organization's total direct costs are. Now, how do we figure out what their indirect costs are? We back up from all the specifics. We don't look at specific programs. We don't look at individual projects. We just look at how much do they pay out for office space in total? How much do they pay for their electric bill in total? How much do they pay for internet, any other utilities, the phone, things like that? Do they employ a receptionist to answer the phone? That's someone who doesn't work on any specific project, but they work for the overall organization. Do you have fundraising staff? What's their salary, if that's the case? All of the costs that are involved in the institution as a whole, but that you can't direct connectly to one particular project. So let's say we did that, we added up the rent, we added up the bills, and it came to $100,000. We figure out the indirect cost rate. We divide that total of indirect costs into the total of all the direct costs. So we divide that $100,000 into that $500,000 for direct costs. This hypothetical organization, their indirect cost rate is 20%. So if you remember maybe what we said about the fringe benefit rate earlier, you have your subtotal of what things cost, and then based on what your fringe benefit rate was, you took, say, 20% of your subtotal and add it to the subtotal, same thing here. Figure out all your costs, whether it's personnel, non-personnel, everything all together. If your indirect cost rate was 20%, take 20% of that subtotal and tack it on to that subtotal here. So if your direct costs in your budget all came to $500,000, for instance, so 20% of that, add it to 500,000, and then you will have your total expenses. Keep in mind, maybe 20% is your indirect cost rate, but if you are talking to a funder who says they only cover up to 10%, then if you're comfortable working with that funder, you would only be able to put down 10% instead of the reality, which is 20%. And that's just an individual judgment call. Are you comfortable taking only half the amount of indirect costs that you truly need, and you're just going to make up the difference elsewhere through other funding sources? Or are you going to say no to that funder and only deal with funders who will give the total amount that you need? That's honestly up to you. But there is no one true indirect cost rate. This is another area where people sometimes ask if there's a magic number. Does this mean our indirect cost rate should be 10%? No. Like, if it really is that, then great. Some people's indirect cost rates are 30%. Some people it's 40%. It depends. As long as the number is real and true and you can defend it if someone asks about it, then it's fine. These things depend on a lot of stuff. Sometimes geography. If you are based in a really high cost of living area, for instance, where real estate is expensive, then you probably would have a higher indirect cost rate, and there's a reason for it. It's just know what that rate is and know how to add it within a budget, and know what kind of compromises you're willing to make when you're dealing with a funder who doesn't cover full costs. So that's your indirect costs there. So at that point, you have your expenses. So now let's talk about income. Income is going to consist of a couple of major categories. So you have your grants and contributions, and you have your earned income. Here's what this looks like in a budget. Don't worry if you don't have something filled out for all of these things. Just start where you are and see what's the best you can do. So your income doesn't have to be perfect. Funders don't expect perfection of you, even though sometimes it seems like they do, but they don't. They just want to know you're thinking about these things and that you have a plan, that you're aware of how much money you have, how much money you need, etc. So think through if you have money coming from any of these places you see here. Do you receive any government funding? I know government funding for the arts is kind of becoming a rare thing, but if you did, put down whatever you receive. Do you have any other foundation grants that you have already received? Put down how much you've received. So this is mostly referring to whatever amount of money you have already confirmed that you have already gotten this money. Otherwise, if you've applied, for instance, to other foundations, but you haven't gotten the grant yet, you can put things down as pending, just so that they know that there is some possible funding coming in, but it's not confirmed yet. Like you could say, oh, I applied for a grant from the Ford Foundation, put in parentheses, pending, and that amount. So keep in mind, again, that foundations usually don't like to be your only funder, so they like to see money coming from a variety of different places here. And you should honestly like to see money coming from a variety of different places here. It just makes you more safe, more secure. It means if you lose a funding stream or something drops, you have other types of funding to help make up the difference. So yeah, if you have other funders, put them down. Do you have any corporate support? So these might be corporate foundations. In many cases, they might be corporate sponsors, things like that. A corporate sponsorship, that's different from a grant because there's much more mutual benefit going on there. Corporations, like I said in the last session, frequently give for reasons of, it's like advertising for them, it's visibility. But if you have a corporation that has agreed to sponsor you, for instance, put down whatever you've received from companies. Do you have individual donors? Sometimes when you're just starting out, individual donors are one of the easiest places to begin. Start with like your network of friends and family, maybe your immediate network, and build from there. People get intimidated when they're first starting out with all of this, when they really just barely have any money to work with. Just start with where you are and do the best that you can. If like you have a handful of people who've given you some funding, who've like given you money as individuals, just figure out, okay, we're allocating this much for this film, put that down, and at least you'll have another source of income to show a funder that you've received. Federated giving programs, I wouldn't worry about that. That's mostly just a nonprofit organization thing, like the combined federal campaign, stuff like that, but don't worry about that. So you have your grants and contributions. Earned income. Interesting thing with a lot of organizations is a lot of places don't really rely on donations as much as people think they do. On average, half of how different organizations sustain themselves is through earned income. This is business-like activity, revenue-generating activity, charging for goods and services. If you have events, you could have a fundraising event. Granted, in a pandemic, maybe not, but people are having a lot of virtual fundraising events at least. So you might get money that way. That's classified as earned income. Publications and products. Are you publishing something that you charge for? Do you put out a book or something, or a piece of research that costs money? You can charge for that. It could be something as simple as t-shirts with a logo on it. That counts as earned income. Anything that you are able to sell or a service that you provide that costs money, that is earned income. And if you don't have an earned income stream already, there's no one-size-fits-all solution for everybody, but it's always at least worth thinking about of what could you do for an earned income stream that could make you a little bit of something. Membership and dues, this again is more of a nonprofit type thing, like associations that have members. If you're in a position where whatever you do has members, then great, you would have membership dues. That would be a form of money. This might not apply to you though. And then look at the bottom there, in-kind support. So when I asked a little while ago whether you had volunteers or whether anyone had donated any supplies or equipment to you, that's in-kind support. In-kind support just means someone's giving you something other than money. It means anything that you received that's not in the form of money, but it has a monetary value, and that includes your volunteers. That will be among your income as well. So again, if you're really in the early stages and you really don't have much money yet for this, sometimes in-kind support can help you out when you're trying to show that you have something in the income section. Even if you haven't gotten any other grants yet or anything like that, you might have some in-kind support. Someone donated a bunch of supplies to you. Put that in your income. And overall, whatever it is, add everything up from whatever columns you're able to fill out, and that will give you your total income here. Now, let's talk in a little more detail about in-kind contributions. What do we mean by that? So again, in-kind contributions are anything that is not money. So this can mean either people donating their time or a person or a company donating objects. Like it could be something as simple as someone donates food to feed your crew on set, something like that. Or it could be you don't have money to pay a web designer, but you know someone who agreed to donate their time and make you a website for free. that person would normally charge money for that service, but they gave it to you for free. So what I'm driving at here is anytime you receive in-kind contributions, such as a volunteer, you put that under both your expense section and your income section. It goes in both parts of your budget. The two should balance each other out. It should be the same amount in both. So why is this? This is because even if you are receiving the thing for free or the person's work for free, it's still an expense of the program, and it should be reflected as such. If that person didn't volunteer their time and their labor to create a website for your film, you would have had to go out there and pay someone to do it. So the way it works is you figure out how much would it have cost you to go out there and pay, for instance, a web designer to create a site for your film. That becomes the expense for the program, however that much that would have cost. And if they're charging on an hourly rate, and let's say it takes them 25 hours to create the website, then you put 25 hours worth of that fee in your expense. But that exact same amount of money that you came up with as your calculation, put that same number in the income side. It's an expense of the program because you would have had to pay for it if you had not received it for free, but you did receive it, so that means that cost is covered. Does that make sense? Whatever you get for donated equipment or donated volunteer time, it will go the exact same number in both columns. Now, let's say you have someone volunteering their time, but you don't know how much to put down as a fee for them. It's easy if someone is giving you skilled labor, like if someone is a web designer or someone is a lawyer, something like that, where you can figure out what that usual hourly rate would be for a web designer or a lawyer or a marketing expert or whatever it is. Then it's just whatever that standard hourly rate is for that type of person, multiplied by how many hours they're donating of their time to your project. And that's easy. If you just have a volunteer who's not really doing skilled work, but just kind of helping out here and there, but you know how many hours roughly they're donating. The independent sector does a survey every single year to figure out the dollar value of volunteer time. And I think the current number is about $25 per hour. So if you're not sure what to put down for a number, just use the independent sector's number. You want to check with them. They're just independentsector.org. But for instance, $25 an hour times, let's say the person spends 10 hours volunteering their time with you, $25 an hour times 10 hours, that's $250, for instance, of volunteer time under both the expense side of your program and as income for your program. Same number in both, they cancel each other out. And it shows the funder that you do have support for your project, even if it's not always directly financial. And it shows that you've done your homework, you've been thinking this through, that you know how to add every expense to your project. You haven't been forgetting about stuff. In-kind contributions and volunteers, these are one of the most likely things that people totally forget to put in their budget. And this is one thing that can make you stand out, is if you remember to include in-kind contributions. If someone donates like a piece of technology for your project, don't just shrug your shoulders, use it, and forget to put it in your budget, because you're using it for your film. You're using it. It is part of the project. So just make sure you remember to include that stuff. And it's going to make you look extra credible to these funders. So I hope that makes sense. Other things that they may ask for from you as part of your budget. So a lot of this refers to nonprofit organizations. So in many cases, if you have a fiscal sponsor, you'll want to talk to your fiscal sponsor for whatever they're able to provide for you. Like that fiscal sponsor will have, for instance, their IRS Form 990. That's their tax forms that makes them a nonprofit. Organization-wide budgets for recent years, things like that. Anything that you're not sure about that you see this funder is asking for, and either you don't know what this is or where you get it, or you just don't have it, don't just leave it out. Call the funder and ask. You could call them and say, I don't have audited financial statements, because a lot of people don't. It's expensive to get that. And just ask if there's something you can send in its place. And that way, again, you'll have an answer to your question so that you don't make a big mistake in your grant application. And you will have had a chance to have a conversation with the funder. It's great for the relationship. Never pass up an easy opportunity to have a conversation with your funder. It will always help you. So these are all the types of things that they might ask for. The budget narrative, that is something that you are very likely to create on your own. The budget narrative is just a document that explains anything that's in your budget that doesn't immediately make sense. Like if there's something confusing where they might not know what a certain expense is, the budget narrative will explain. This is what that confusing thing is in the budget in row number 12. Or let's say a salary looks really strange, unusually high or unusually low. The budget narrative would explain why the salary is what it is. It's really nice when they let you have a budget narrative, and they frequently will, because that way anything that looks weird will be explained away and it will make them more comfortable. But that's a very common thing. Sometimes it's done in the form of footnotes underneath the budget, like right there in the spreadsheet. Sometimes it's a separate document next to it. It depends. Just follow their directions and just do it the way they say to do it. Also, for any of these documents that they ask for that you do have, or things that you have from a fiscal sponsor, for instance, that you might need to share, like an IRS determination letter, things like that. Try to keep any of these basic technical documents in what we call a document drawer for easy access for any grant proposals. This could be like a literal physical drawer, but frequently it'll just be like a folder on your computer. It's good to have things in the form of a PDF, just because PDFs play nicely with everyone's computers. Pretty much anyone can open a PDF. But you can have hard copies too if it's useful. Okay. Now, just a little bit more, and then if anyone has questions afterwards, we will take questions. So let's say you get the grant. Hooray. This is not the end of the journey, either for dealing with the funder or for looking at your budget. You do not get to toss your budget out the window after you get the grant. It would be a terrible idea. Your budget is going to be something that you need to observe and monitor throughout the year and throughout the entire duration of the project, because you need to use it as a project management tool, really. You can look at your budget periodically to make sure that you're on track. Are things progressing the way they're supposed to? Have you spent the amount that you thought you would have spent by now? Are you over budget? Are you under budget? It's good to know the difference. Partly because it can allow you a chance to course correct. If halfway through the year you've spent much less than you thought you would, maybe you know that you can spend a little bit more now, stuff like that. But also, if you have spent significantly more or less than you thought you would at this point, tell your funder. Any major variances from the budget, whether it's over or under, the funder is going to need to know. They just don't want you to surprise them at the end of the year. Funders, like I said much earlier, they're very, very risk averse, and they don't like being surprised. If you're over budget, don't just sit on that information until the end of your grant report. Call your funder and tell them. First of all, so they won't be surprised. Second of all, fun fact about funders, Because they have to give out at least 5% of their assets every year, or else they get into trouble with the IRS. In some cases, foundations towards the end of the year, they have a little bit of extra money that they need to give away, or else they won't have made their 5%. So sometimes if they have a little extra pool of money at the end of the year that they need to give away, if they already know that you were over budget and you need a little bit of help, they could conceivably, if you have a good relationship with them, give you a little bit extra to cover your costs. So there's that. Also, let's say you're under budget. You've spent way less than you said you were going to spend and you have all this extra money. Tell the funder about that as well. Partly, again, because they don't like to be surprised and they want to think that you're being responsible and that you're being professional. And like, if you tell the funder that you have all of this extra money you haven't spent yet, they usually don't want you to give the money back. So you don't have to worry about that. They're not going to say, oh, there's $10,000 that you still haven't spent yet. You have to send that back to us. They're not usually going to do that. Because if you sent the money back, that means they have to hurry up and find someone else to give that money to so that it doesn't count against them and they don't get in trouble with the IRS. So because of that, they would rather you keep that money. But this way, you should probably ask, oh, is there something else that you're okay with me spending it on? Don't just start spending it. Just ask them about it and say, oh, we're really under budget here, but there is something we could do with this project where we could spend this money on that. Is that okay with you? Or we have this other project on the side. Would it be okay if we apply this money towards that other project? And just check with them and see what they're comfortable with. But really, funders are going to want you to explain any major variances that will be in your budget. It's okay if your numbers are not exactly what you said they were going to be, if you're over or under with something, because that's life. And it's certainly not going to be the first time it's happened. They just want to know. They just don't want to be surprised. And there's going to be reports that you turn in, of course, that are going to explain, here's our actual versus our projected financial situation, but make sure that you tell them in the moment as well. It's the nice thing to do. So that's what happens after the budget is approved. Just don't keep information from your funder. The more you can stay open and honest and in steady communication with your funder, the more likely it is that they will continue to want to work with you in the future. Okay, so some key takeaways, and then if you have questions, I'm happy to take questions. So know your project inside and out. Yes, this is math, but this is easy math. It's just know what are all the things that you need to make this project happen and write them all down and write what they all cost. Estimate all your direct costs. If it's something new that you've never done before, just think about what would it cost to hire a camera crew, for instance, and put that down. We need to pay permits to shoot in this particular location. How much does that cost? Put it down. Include your percentage for indirect costs because they exist. They exist for everybody. It's just a matter of whether the funder is going to be comfortable paying for it or not. And estimate all your possible income, your actual income and pending income that you're hoping that you may get. So this gives them a picture of the present of where your income is at and what the potential future might be. And this all feeds a little bit into the financial sustainability piece of your narrative, where you talk about here's what the financial future may look like for this project, if that makes any sense. Okay, here's a couple other classes that we offer. If anything about corporate giving sounds interesting to you, normally we do in-person classes as well. In the pandemic, we're temporarily not doing in-person classes, but we do online versions of a lot of our classes, which includes our corporate giving class. But also we have another e-learning class, and I think in the link that I sent around earlier to all of our self-paced online classes, you would find creating a sound proposal budget in that one as well, and that will kind of guide you through the budgeting process. But yeah, thank you so much for your time. I will stop sharing, and then if you have questions about either budgets or anything you forgot to ask after the first session, I'm happy to answer a few questions. Okay. But yeah, I understand if any of this gets a little overwhelming at times, but just if you start your process with the budget before you deal with the narrative, that'll probably put you in a better position. It'll give you a stronger narrative, and you can at least get the budget out of the way, at least your first pass at it, and it might make your life a little bit easier. Okay, I see a question asking, could I include the estimated total contributions by other potential funders? Yes. So if you want to do that, you just list them as pending. So that's the difference there. So frequently your budget, if the word pending doesn't show up next to an income source, they're going to assume that you already have that money. But otherwise, if like you have an application out to a foundation, but you haven't heard back yet, however much you asked for from that foundation, put it under income, but write pending. So they'll know there's a possible income rather than not possible. Okay, I see questions about budget templates. I am going to find a resource for you. So we have, so the Candid Learning site that I mentioned, it used to be called GrantSpace. Some of you may have used it before when it was called GrantSpace. We renamed it last week, but it's all the same place. Candid Learning has a good resources section. So if either Catalina or Erilyn could help copy any links I'm putting into the comments here, I'm moving over a sample documents section from the Candid Learning site. That's just learning.candid.org. Over here, this provides samples both of proposals as a whole. So you can see samples of what good grant proposals look like in total, real ones that got funding. They include commentary from the funders themselves on what was good about it. And you'll find some examples of budgets in here as well. There's just a few of these, but they'll give you an idea, what do real life budgets look like? So these might kind of help you get oriented for what these will look like. Frequently, like you'll put these either in an Excel document or a Google spreadsheet. It's always going to be like in a spreadsheet format. One section, listing of all the expenses with a total. Another section, all the income sources listed, and then a total. And ultimately, like your ideal is that the expenses and the income are just about the same number. So that should hopefully be helpful. Okay, I see a follow-up question about that creating a sound proposal budget class, which keep in mind is a class that is about to get updated because we created that online class about 5 years ago, and it's about to get a refresh very soon. But yes, partially a sound proposal budget means it's a realistic budget, but also that it is stable and it makes sense. It is clear. Really, budgets should always be as clear as possible. Perfect, vivid clarity. Nothing should ever be vague. Nothing should ever be confusing. Go into detail as much as you realistically can, so that the funder never has questions. Like, don't just put under expenses supplies, $10,000, and the funder just has to guess what you mean by supplies. Making sure everything is clear and complete. That's all it means, that people can figure it out. But yeah, it'll be a helpful course if you just kind of want to take your time with figuring out budgets. People get worried about budgets, but they're so much simpler than you think they're going to be. Also, if anyone has follow-up questions that you want to like send to me one-on-one that are easier to answer by email later on, I'm going to provide my email address because I get questions from people about grant proposals all the time. You can feel free to contact me. You can also find me on LinkedIn if need be too. And I'm happy to answer questions that way as well. Let's see, any other questions about the budget or anything else that you feel like you have to know in order to do an effective grant proposal here? Great. It sounds like we're doing relatively well so far. You know what? I forget if I put this into the chat before, but I'm putting a link to our online librarian service. So the online librarian service, these are not bots. They're not robots or anything. These are actual librarians that work for Candid that answer any and all questions about anything. But the reason why I'm putting this link here is if you want to research foundation funders using like the foundation directory online, it's a really, really, really helpful research database so that you can find potential funders. This includes corporate funders as well, because I know in the arts, people tend to have a lot of good luck with corporate funders. And if you see a child next to me, that's my son, Liam, popping in for a visit. But this includes corporate funders. This includes art-specific funders, community foundations, whatever you can possibly find. Normally, that's a subscription database. But if you want to get free access to it, contact the online librarians and ask where you can get free access to the foundation directory online at a local library. And they will figure out where your nearest partner library is that might be offering free remote access, because a lot of local libraries throughout the pandemic are going to be providing free access to this research database, which normally costs a fair amount of money. So I hope that will be useful for you. All right. If anyone has any last questions before I release you into the world of grant seeking and grant writing, speak now or forever hold your peace. All right. Well, in that case, I wish you all luck, and just make sure that if you need a little extra help, that you make use of those other resources. Candid Learning has a lot of stuff. We have other classes. You might enjoy the corporate giving class if you're interested in learning more about how to get corporate money, or use our online librarians, and that should be helpful as well. I see a question of, what if you don't know how long it will take to do something? Some of this may come down to talking to your peers in the field a bit. If you've done films before and you've figured out like a sense of how many hours it will often take, like see if you can break it down to hours, because that way you can figure out a good rate for things. But if other people have done this work before and estimated, usually it's going to take about like this long to do the editing process, for instance, and do it that way. Get advice from people. Networking is useful in so many different ways, and this includes like your project management as well, and this will help figure it out. It doesn't have to be exact, because nothing is ever exact, but probably assume more time rather than less time, because a lot of things take longer than you think they will. All right, I see a request for a link for the corporate training. Let me get some information on this. I know sometimes we will do live webinars, free live webinars on corporate giving. And so our introduction to corporate giving class will be very, very helpful for that. Let me see here, but we also have a recorded webinar that you can watch just anytime on that subject. Here we are, Introduction to Corporate Giving. It's a very popular class. I know this was probably, Introduction to Corporate Giving is the first class I ever taught when I was starting out in this, and it's interesting learning how corporations operate because they do funding differently than a regular foundation would. Their motivations are very different. So I'm putting a link to that for you all as well. Because while foundations give for reasons of just objective social good, we want to make a difference in the world and they mean it. The difference is that corporations, while they may say that they're doing this because they want to make a difference, the reality much of the time is that corporations are giving because it's good for business. It's really good for business for them to give to various social endeavors here and there. And they're going to give to creative projects because they think that either directly or indirectly, it will make them money in some way or another. That's really the basis of it. But yeah, that Introduction to Corporate Giving course will kind of give you an overview of how that works in a little more detail. Okay, so if we don't have any more questions, then I'm just going to wish you luck. And if you think of anything else that you need help with, feel free to email me or make use of any of the other resources or trainings that you find on our Candid Learning site. And I hope those will help you as well. And good luck. You can do this. This can be a tricky and tedious sometimes skill, but it's a skill that any of us can learn as long as we take the time to learn what are the qualities the good grant proposal requires. But you can do this. Best of luck to you all, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Thank you for all your time. And thank you to everybody that tuned in. I'm going to put together the list of emails that everybody shared here and also on our Eventbrite, and I'm going to be sharing it with you. So maybe later on this week or the upcoming week, maybe you can also recap with them. Okay? Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.